How were the chocolates? My son Thomas called the morning after my 70th birthday. The question seemed innocent, normal. I answered honestly, "Oh, Thomas, I gave them to Leticia and the kids. You know how much they love sweets." The silence that followed was terrifying. I could hear my own heartbeat as I waited for his response. Then he exploded. "You did what?" He screamed with a rage I had never heard in his voice. "You gave them to Leticia and the kids? Are you crazy?" His voice trembled in a way that frightened me. It wasn't just anger, it was pure panic. "Thomas, I don't understand," I said, trying to stay calm. "I thought you'd be pleased I shared your gift with your family." But he kept screaming, asking if I was sure I hadn't eaten a single chocolate, if I'd given away the whole box, if the kids had already eaten them. His questions were so specific, so urgent, that I became suspicious. Why was it so important that I hadn't tried the chocolates? Why did he seem relieved I hadn't eaten them, but desperate I'd given them to his own family? That afternoon, Leticia called. Her voice was different. Worried. "Dorothy, the kids felt sick after eating the chocolates. We had to take them to the hospital." My blood froze. The doctor, my own son, tried to kill me with a box of poisoned chocolates, and I unknowingly saved my life by making my daughter-in-law and grandchildren jealous. When he called and asked if I had eaten the chocolates, I told him, "No, I gave them to Leticia and the kids." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then he screamed like a desperate man, "You did what?" In that moment, I didn't understand why Thomas was so upset. I thought he was angry because I had given his gift to other people. How naive I was. My name is Dorothy. I am 90 years old. For 40 years, I sacrificed everything for my son Thomas. Everything. My youth, my dreams, my savings. I adopted him when he was just 2 years old, after his biological parents were killed in an accident. I gave him my last name, my unconditional love, my entire life. But on that day, my 69th birthday, everything changed. That box of handmade chocolates that arrived at my door seemed like a beautiful gift from a grateful son. The chocolates were exquisite, expensive. They came in an elegant box with a card that read, "For the best mother in the world, with love, Thomas." I was so touched. I hadn't received a loving gesture from him in months. Since he married Leticia, everything changed. She came into our lives like a storm and filled my son's head with poison against me. "Your mother is too nosy," she told him. "You're too old to be taken care of by her," she whispered in his ear. And Thomas, my Thomas, the boy I had raised with so much love, began to change. Little by little, he distanced himself. The visits became less frequent, the calls colder, the hugs more distant. But I kept waiting. I kept believing that my son would become his old self again. That morning, when the chocolates arrived, I thought it had finally happened. That my son had remembered how much he loved me. That Leticia hadn't managed to completely destroy the bond we had built over so many years. The chocolates looked delicious. They were from an exclusive brand, the kind that costs a fortune. Each piece was a work of art, decorated with golden details and perfect shapes. But I had always been this way. I always thought of others before thinking of myself. These chocolates are too good for me alone, I thought. Leticia and the kids will enjoy them much more. The little ones had always been my weakness. Despite all the contempt their mother showed me, I loved those children. They were my grandchildren, the extension of my Thomas, the only pure thing that remained in this toxic relationship. So I took the box, carefully wrapped it again, and made my way to Thomas's house. When I knocked on the door, Leticia opened it. As always, she greeted me with that fake smile I hated so much, that smile that didn't reach her eyes, that screamed contempt even though her lips pretended politeness. "Hello, Dorothy," she said with that condescending tone she used with me. "What brings you here?" I handed her the box of chocolates and explained that they were from Thomas for me, but that I wanted to share them with her and the children. For a moment, I saw something strange in her eyes, like surprise, but not the good kind. It was more like fear, confusion. But she quickly composed herself and took the box. "What a nice gesture from Thomas," she murmured. "The kids will be thrilled. She didn't invite me in." She never did. She always found an excuse to keep me at the door, as if I were a peddler and not the grandmother of her children. This time she said, "The kids are sleeping. It's been a very long day. Better another time. I went home with a somewhat sad heart, but also with a certain satisfaction. I had done something good. I had shared the joy of my son's gift with his family. That night, I went to bed thinking that this gesture might, just might, soften things between Leticia and me. The next day, the phone rang early. It was Thomas. His voice sounded strange, tense. "Mom," he said, "how are the chocolates?" The question surprised me. It was unusual for him to be so interested in whether I had enjoyed a gift. Normally, after giving me something, he seemed to completely forget about it. "Oh, Thomas," I answered honestly. "I gave them to Leticia and the kids. You know how much they love sweets?" The silence that followed was terrifying. It was as if the world had stopped. I could hear my own heart beating as I waited for his response. Then he exploded. "You did what?" He screamed with a rage I had never heard in his voice. "You gave them to Leticia and the kids? Are you crazy?" His voice trembled in a way that frightened me. It wasn't just anger, it was pure panic. "Thomas, I don't understand," I said, trying to stay calm. "I thought you'd be pleased that I shared your gift with your family." But he kept screaming, more and more desperate. He kept asking me if I was sure I hadn't eaten a single chocolate, if I had given away the whole box, if the kids had already eaten them. His questions were so specific, so urgent, that I became suspicious. Why was it so important to him that I hadn't tried the chocolates? Why did he seem relieved that I hadn't eaten them, but desperate that I had given them to his own family? He hung up abruptly after screaming at me that I was stupid, that I had ruined everything. I was left holding the phone, trembling, not understanding what had happened. But something in me, a maternal instinct that I had developed over years of caring and protecting, told me that something was terribly wrong. That afternoon, Leticia called me. Her voice sounded different, worried. "Dorothy," she told me, "the kids felt sick after eating the chocolates. We had to take them to the hospital." My blood froze. "What happened to them?" I asked with my heart in my throat. "The doctors say it was food poisoning," she replied. "But it's strange. The chocolates smelled funny when we opened them." But the kids had already eaten several before we noticed. My world began to crumble. The chocolates my son had sent me, the chocolates I had given with so much love, had made my grandchildren sick. But there was something else. In Leticia's voice, I discovered something that made me tremble. It was fear, yes, but also understanding, as if she had finally understood something that had been playing out before her eyes without her noticing it. That night I couldn't sleep. The puzzle pieces began to fit together in my head with terrifying clarity. Thomas's reaction when he learned I had given away the chocolates, his desperation when he knew I hadn't eaten them, his relief mixed with panic, the specific questions about whether I had tried even a small piece. And then, like lightning in the darkness, the truth hit me with all its brutal force. My son, my own son, whom I had raised and loved unconditionally, had tried to poison me. The following days were a nightmare. The children recovered, thank God, but the poison had left traces. Leticia confessed to me that the doctors had found traces of arsenic in their little bodies. Arsenic, a word I only knew from crime movies, was now part of my most terrifying reality. My daughter-in-law spoke to me for the first time in years without that mask of contempt. Her voice trembled as she said, "Dorothy, I don't think those chocolates were meant to be shared. I think they were specifically for you." Her words confirmed what my heart already knew, but my mind refused to accept. Thomas had disappeared. He didn't answer the phone, didn't respond to messages. When Leticia looked for him at his workplace, they told her he had requested emergency leave. He had fled like the coward he was, leaving his wife and children to suffer the consequences of his diabolical plan. But I knew my son. I knew where to find him. I knew that when cornered, he always ran to the same place, to his Aunt Nora's house, my younger sister. She had always had a weakness for Thomas, always justified his mistakes, always protected him from the consequences of his actions. I drove to Nora's house, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. 40 years of unconditional love. 40 years of sacrifice. 40 years in which I had given everything of myself. And this was what I got in return. A son who wanted to see me dead. When I knocked on the door, Nora opened it with a guilty face. "Dorothy," she murmured, "I didn't know you were coming." But I had already seen Thomas's car parked around the corner. "I know he's here," I said, with a voice I didn't recognize as my own. Thomas appeared behind her like a ghost. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. But what shocked me most was the expression on his face. There was no remorse, no guilt, only resentment, as if I were the one to blame for this whole disaster. "Why?" was the only thing I could ask him. "Why did you want to kill me?" My voice broke on that last word. Kill. My own son had wanted to kill me. His answer tore my soul into 1,000 pieces. "Because you're an obstacle," he said with a coldness that froze the blood in my veins. "Because you've always been an obstacle. Because I need your inheritance and you just never die." My inheritance. Of course, it all came down to money. The money I had worked for day and night over decades. The money I had saved by living like a homeless person to secure a future for him. The money I wanted to leave him when I died, naturally, in old age, surrounded by the love of my family. "But I didn't know you had so much money," he continued with that poisonous voice, "until I saw the bank documents last year when you got sick. $2 million, Mom. $2 million that I need now, not when you're 90. $2 million that I had earned with blood, sweat, and tears. $2 million that represented 40 years of work and deprivation. Besides," he added, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "you're already old. What else do you want to do with your life? What do you need so much money for at your age?" His words were daggers in my heart. Each syllable was a deeper betrayal than the previous one. Nora tried to intervene. "Thomas, don't talk like that," she murmured, but he silenced her with a look. "Aunt, you know I'm right. She's already lived her life. I have a family to feed, children to raise, a future ahead of me." "A future built on my corpse," I replied with a bitterness I didn't know I carried within me. "A future bought with my death." He looked at me with contempt, as if I were the crazy one, as if I were the villain in this twisted story. "Don't be so dramatic," he told me. "It would have been quick. The chocolates contained enough arsenic to make it look like a natural heart attack. No one would have suspected anything. You would have died peacefully in your sleep, and I would have inherited what would have been mine anyway." His words revealed to me the depth of his betrayal. It hadn't been an impulse, a moment of madness. It had been a calculated, meticulous, cold plan. He had researched the poison. He had bought the most expensive chocolates to mask the taste. He had calculated the exact dose. My death had been planned with the same dedication I had put into planning his birthdays for years. "And what happened?" I asked him. "Why didn't your perfect plan work?" His face contorted into a grimace of frustration. "Because you're too stupid to eat chocolates that your own son gives you," he spat at me. "Because you always have to be the martyr. Always have to give everything. Always have to be the selfless, saintly mother." The irony was suffocating. The same flaw he criticized in me, my tendency to give before receiving, had saved my life. My instinct to share the gift with his children had destroyed his murder plan. But the worst part, he continued with growing anger, is that Leticia now knows everything. The kids almost died because of you, because of your mania for distributing what doesn't belong to you. He was blaming me. After trying to murder me, he was blaming me for the poisoning of his own children. Leticia had appeared at the door during our conversation. Her face was pale, her eyes full of tears. She had heard everything. The final confirmation that her husband had not only tried to kill his mother-in-law, but had also been willing to sacrifice his own children in the process. She said to Thomas, with a broken voice, "How could you? How could you put our children in danger?" He turned to her with the same coldness he had shown me. "Because nothing was going to happen," he replied. Because the poison was for her, not for you. But you knew I always share everything with the kids, Leticia screamed. You knew there was a possibility they would eat those chocolates. Thomas shrugged as if talking about the weather. It was a calculated risk, he murmured. A calculated risk. The children I had helped raise, the children who filled my afternoons with joy when everything else had turned gray, were for him a calculated risk in his plan to murder me. In that moment, I understood that the son I had raised, the child I had adopted and loved as if he had come from my own womb, had died long ago. The man standing before me was a stranger, a dangerous stranger who had been able to look me in the eyes for years while planning my death. It's over, I said with a calm that surprised me. Everything between us is over. He laughed, a bitter, cruel laugh. What are you going to do, Mom? Call the police? Turn in your own son? You know you'll never do that. You're too weak. Too weak. For 40 years I had been too weak to say no to him. Too weak to set boundaries for him. Too weak to see that my unconditional love had turned him into a monster. But on that day, in that house, faced with the proof of his absolute betrayal, something changed in me. You're right, I told him. I was weak for a long time. But that ends today. I turned around and walked to the door. Wait and see what a weak woman can do when she finally finds her strength. His screams followed me to the street. He yelled at me that I was ungrateful, that I was abandoning him after everything he had done for me. Everything he had done for me. The height of cynicism. Trying to kill me was, in his twisted head, something he had done for me. That night, in the solitude of my house, I cried like I hadn't cried in decades. I cried for the son I had lost, for the wasted years, for the betrayed love. But above all, I cried for the woman who had been naive, compliant, blind to the evil that was growing before her eyes. When my tears dried up, I made a decision. Thomas had been right about one thing. I had been too weak. But that weak woman died that night. Tomorrow a new Dorothy would be born. A Dorothy who had learned that boundless love is not a virtue, but complicity. A Dorothy who had discovered that sometimes, to protect yourself, you have to become what your enemies least expect. My phone rang. It was Stephen, my lawyer, an old family friend. Dorothy, he told me. Leticia called me. She told me everything. Are you okay? For the first time in days, I smiled. I'm perfect, Stephen. And I have work for you. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was complete. In the following weeks, while Thomas believed he had emotionally destroyed me, I was building the foundations of my revenge. The first step was moving. I couldn't continue living in that house where I had raised a viper, where every corner reminded me of my naivety. Stephen helped me find an apartment in the most exclusive area of the city. A penthouse with panoramic views that cost more in 1 month than Thomas earned in 3. When I signed the lease, I saw the surprise in the real estate agent's eyes. A 69-year-old woman, modestly dressed, paying cash for a luxury apartment. It's for my retirement, I said with a smile. I've decided it's time to treat myself. Retirement. What a liberating word. I retired as a mother. I retired as a victim. I retired as the woman who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. The apartment was spectacular. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen that looked like something out of a magazine. But what I liked best was the study, a quiet room where I could plan, think, become the strategist Thomas could never have imagined. Stephen was my first ally in this new life. For years he had handled my basic legal matters, wills, insurance, minor formalities. But now I needed more. I needed a legal warrior who would help me systematically destroy the life of the man who had tried to murder me. Dorothy, he told me at our first serious meeting, this is going to be brutal. Thomas won't give up easily. He'll fight. He'll lie. He'll try to manipulate the situation in his favor. I leaned back in the leather chair in his office and looked at him. Stephen, he underestimated me for 40 years. Now it's my turn to surprise him. The first thing we did was secure my money. Thomas knew about the main account, But he knew nothing about the other 3. He knew nothing about the savings accounts I had conscientiously renewed every year. He knew nothing about the stocks I had bought with the extra money from my weekend jobs. He didn't know that while he thought his mother was stupid, she had built a modest but solid financial empire. In total, Stephen said after reviewing all the documents, we're talking about almost $4 million. Not 2 like he believes. 4 million. 40 years of sacrifice transformed into economic power. 40 years of living like a poor person to die like a queen. But money was just a tool. The real weapon was information. Stephen hired a private investigator, a former police officer named Robert who specialized in family cases. What we discovered in the following weeks left me speechless. Thomas hadn't just planned my death because of the inheritance. He had debts I knew nothing about. Gambling debts, debts with loan sharks, debts that had made my death an urgent necessity for him. My son wasn't just a failed murderer. He was a bankrupt gambling addict who had gambled away his family's future at my expense. Here's the evidence, Robert said, handing me a folder full of photos, documents, bank records. Your son owes very dangerous people over $500,000, people who don't accept excuses. The photos showed him in casinos, in illegal betting offices, at nighttime meetings with threatening-looking men. He had mortgaged the house he lived in with Leticia without her knowledge. He had pawned his wife's car. He had emptied the children's savings to pay interest. My son wasn't just a murderer. He was a thief who had stolen his own family's future. Leticia knows nothing about this, Robert continued. He's been lying to her for months. He tells her there are problems at work, that payments are delayed, that they need to save. But the truth is, he's using the household money for gambling. The information was devastating, but also perfect. Thomas had built his own prison with his lies and addictions. I just had to push on the bars for everything to collapse. Meanwhile, he believed he had defeated me. 3 weeks had passed since our confrontation at Nora's house, and I had given no sign of life. I hadn't called him, hadn't shown up at his house, hadn't made a scene. In his narcissistic head, this confirmed his theory. I was too weak to face him, but I was working every day from my new apartment. I coordinated the next steps with Stephen. Every night I reviewed Robert's reports. I learned more about the monster my son had become. Every morning I planned the next step of my meticulous revenge. The first phase was psychological. I needed Thomas to feel in control, to feel he had won. I needed him to feel secure, to lower his guard. That's why I had given no sign of life. That's why I had let him believe I was hiding in some corner, crying, and feeling defeated. Stephen had explained the legal process to me. We have evidence of the attempted poisoning, he told me. The children's medical analyses, Leticia's testimony, the recordings you made of his confessions. Yes, I had recorded our entire conversation at Nora's house. A small device Robert had given me, hidden in my purse. But, Stephen continued, a criminal trial will be long and complicated. There will be media coverage. There will be a public scandal. Are you prepared for that? I was more than prepared. After 40 years in the shadows, I was ready to step into the light and show the world who Thomas really was. Besides, he added with a smile, we have evidence of fraud, deception, and financial manipulation. We can destroy him economically before the criminal trial even begins. Economically. The word sounded delicious. Thomas had tried to kill me because of money. Now he was going to lose all his money because he had tried to kill me. In those weeks of silence, I also worked on myself. I hired Julia, a personal stylist who completely transformed my image. Goodbye to old conservative clothes. Goodbye to gray, unkempt hair. Goodbye to the hunched posture of a defeated woman. When Julia was done with me, I didn't recognize myself in the mirror. My hair was elegantly dyed brown, cut in a modern style that made me look 10 years younger. My clothes were sophisticated but not ostentatious. High-quality suits, designer shoes, discreet but expensive accessories. Dorothy, Julia said, admiring her work. You look like a woman of power. A woman of power. I liked that. For 40 years I had been a woman of service, a woman of sacrifice, a woman of shadows. Now it was time to be a woman of power. The last element of my transformation was the most important, my attitude. I hired a personal coach, a psychologist who specialized in female empowerment. Dorothy, she told me in our first session. You need to stop seeing yourself as a victim. You're a survivor. You're a warrior. The sessions were enlightening. For decades, I had confused love with submission, kindness with compliance, motherhood with total self-sacrifice. I had raised a monster because I had been afraid of being a bad mother if I set boundaries for him. True love, the psychologist explained to me, involves consequences. When there are no consequences for bad actions, there is no love. There is complicity. For 40 years, I had been complicit in my son's transformation into a sociopath. But no more. The new Dorothy was nobody's accomplice. The new Dorothy was a force of nature that was about to unleash itself like a devastating hurricane over Thomas's world. One evening, exactly 1 month after our confrontation, I decided to make my first public appearance. I carefully chose the location, the most exclusive art gallery in the city, where a private collection of contemporary paintings was being exhibited. I wore a black designer suit, high heels that made me appear taller and more imposing, and jewelry I had bought that same afternoon. When I arrived at the gallery in a luxury taxi, the society photographers turned to look at me. They didn't recognize me, but they instinctively knew I was someone important. I walked through the gallery with a glass of champagne in hand, admiring the artworks and conversing with collectors and critics. For the first time in decades, I felt in my element, elegant, refined, powerful. And then I saw him. Thomas was standing in the opposite corner of the gallery, accompanied by Leticia. She looked tense, uncomfortable, clearly out of place in this luxurious environment. He was trying to impress some businessmen, probably looking for new victims for his schemes. Our eyes met across the room. I saw the shock on his face when he recognized me. The defeated woman he had left crying a month ago had been replaced by this sophisticated and mysterious version of his mother. I approached slowly, enjoying every step. When I reached him, I smiled at him with poisonous sweetness. "Hello, Thomas," I said with a voice that exuded power. "What a surprise to meet you here." His face had turned pale. Leticia looked at me with a mixture of admiration and confusion. The businessman who had been talking with Thomas turned to me with curiosity. "Mom," he stammered. "What are you doing here?" His voice trembled slightly. For the first time in his life, my presence intimidated him. "I'm enjoying my retirement," I replied, taking a sip of champagne. "I've decided it's time to treat myself." The word retirement hung in the air like a veiled threat. The businessmen looked at us with interest. It was obvious there was family tension, but it was also obvious that I was not the victim they had imagined. "Retirement?" one of them asked politely. "What are you retiring from, ma'am?" "From being too generous," I replied without taking my eyes off Thomas. "Sometimes when you give too much, people get used to receiving. There comes a point when you have to stop giving and start demanding." Demanding. The word floated in the air like a storm warning. Thomas knew exactly what it meant. He knew his time of taking without giving was over. He knew the hunt had begun, and that he was now the prey. The following days were marked by exquisite tension. Thomas knew something had changed, but he didn't know what. He had seen me transformed in the gallery into a woman he didn't recognize, and that disturbed him. He began calling me obsessively, but I didn't answer. I let my calls go to voicemail, where I could hear his growing nervousness. "Mom, answer the phone," he said in his messages. "We need to talk. I need to know what you're planning." What you're planning. For the first time in his life, he was afraid of me. For the first time, I was the hunter, and he was the prey. Stephen had begun the legal phase of my revenge. First, he filed a civil lawsuit for attempted murder with all the evidence we had collected. The children's medical analyses, the audio recordings, the testimonies from Leticia, and the medical staff who had treated my grandchildren. "Dorothy," Stephen said in his office, "this lawsuit is going to be a scandal. The media will follow the case. Your story will be in all the news. Perfect. I wanted the whole world to know who Thomas really was. I wanted his neighbors, his co-workers, his friends to know he had tried to murder his own mother. But the civil lawsuit was just the appetizer. The main course was the investigation Robert had completed on Thomas's illegal activities. Mortgage fraud, abuse of family assets, fraud against creditors, tax evasion. My son had built a financial house of cards that was about to collapse. Here are all the documents, Robert said, handing me 3 folders full of evidence. Your son has been stealing from his own family for months. Leticia can sue him for marital fraud and get back everything he stole. Marital fraud. The words sounded delicious. I decided to have a conversation with Leticia. Despite all our previous problems, she was also a victim of Thomas. She too had been deceived, manipulated, stolen from, and most importantly, she was the mother of my grandchildren, the children who had almost died because of their father. I invited her to lunch at the most elegant restaurant in the city. When she arrived, I saw the surprise in her eyes when she saw me in my new version. I was no longer the modest and resigned mother-in-law she had known for years. I was a woman of power who had decided to take control of her destiny. Leticia, I said after we had ordered, we need to talk. She nodded nervously. She knew something big was coming. I know everything about Thomas's debts. I know about the gambling, about the loan sharks, about the mortgage he put on your house without your knowledge. Her face fell apart. How do you know that? She murmured. Because I hired investigators, I replied calmly. Because I decided to stop being the victim and become the hunter. I handed her one of the folders Robert had prepared. Everything is there. Documents, photos, bank records. Leticia searched through the papers with tears in her eyes. Each page was a deeper betrayal. Her husband had not only tried to murder his mother-in-law, but he had also systematically stolen his family's future to feed his gambling addiction. Dorothy, she told me with a broken voice. I didn't know anything about this. He told me there were problems at work that we needed to save. I never thought her voice broke into sobs, that he would destroy our life. Leticia, I said, taking her hand, you're not to blame for anything. Thomas deceived both of us, but now we have the opportunity to get justice. I explained my plan to her. She could file a lawsuit for marital fraud, recover the house, protect the children's future. I would help her with the legal costs. But, I added firmly, I need you to testify against Thomas. I need you to tell the whole truth about the chocolates, about his confession, about everything you witnessed. She didn't hesitate for a moment. Of course, she said. It's the least I can do after everything you've suffered. While we were having lunch, Thomas entered the restaurant. It wasn't a coincidence. He had followed her, worried about this meeting between his wife and his mother. When he saw us together, sharing documents, his face transformed into a mask of panic. He approached our table with hasty steps. What are you doing? He asked with a tense voice. What are you talking about? His desperation was palpable. He knew his world of lies was collapsing. We're talking about you, I replied with a cold smile. We're talking about your debts, your lies, about how you stole from your own family. Thomas saw the documents on the table, and his face completely fell apart. Leticia, he begged his wife, don't listen to this crazy old woman. She's trying to manipulate you to separate us. Crazy old woman. Even in this moment of total panic, he couldn't help but insult me. He was incapable of showing respect or remorse. Thomas, Leticia said with a voice I had never heard from her, a voice full of strength and determination. I know everything. I know about the gambling, about the debts, about the mortgage. I know you've been lying for months. He tried to deny it, but she interrupted him. And I know you tried to kill your mother. The last words she screamed, drawing the attention of the entire restaurant. The diners turned to us, murmuring among themselves. Thomas realized he was being watched and lowered his voice, but his desperation became more and more obvious. Leticia, please, he whispered. We can fix this. We can solve this together. You don't have to listen to this woman. She's always tried to separate us, always manipulating, always manipulating, always blaming others, never taking responsibility for his actions. No, Leticia replied firmly. Not anymore. The lies are over. The manipulations are over. I'm going to protect our children, and that means keeping them away from you. She stood up from the table, took her purse, and walked to the exit. My lawyers will be in touch with you. Thomas remained standing at the table, trembling with rage and helplessness. When Leticia had left, he turned to me with a fury that reminded me why I had decided to destroy him. "This is your fault," he hissed. "You ruined my marriage. You destroyed my family." "I didn't destroy anything," I replied with supernatural calm. "I only brought the truth to light. Your marriage was ruined when you decided to become a liar and a thief. Your family was destroyed when you decided to murder your mother." I stood up from the table and looked him directly in the eyes. "And this is just beginning." His threats followed me to the street. "You're going to regret this," he shouted after me as I got into my taxi. "You're going to pay for destroying my life." Destroying his life. He had tried to literally destroy mine, and now he was complaining because I was defending myself. That night, Stephen called me with news. "Dorothy, the lawsuit is already in process. The media have started calling. They want interviews. They want your version of the story." It was exactly what I had expected. "Schedule the interviews," I said. "It's time for the world to know the truth." The first interview was with the most watched news program in the city. I came to the studio impeccably dressed, with the confidence of a woman who had found her power. The journalist received me with curiosity and compassion. "Mrs. Dorothy," she told me in front of the cameras, "tell us your story. How did you discover that your son had tried to poison you?" I told everything. The chocolates, Thomas's reaction, the children's poisoning, his cold and calculated confession. I spoke calmly, without dramatizing, letting the facts speak for themselves. "How does a mother feel when she discovers her son wants to kill her?" the journalist asked. "She feels free," I replied. "She feels free from an illusion she had maintained for 40 years. She feels free to continue protecting someone who never protected her." The interview went viral. Within hours, my story was all over social media. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. Hundreds of women wrote to me telling me their own stories of ungrateful sons, of toxic families, of unrequited love. But the most satisfying were the comments about Thomas. His co-workers began to recognize him as the son who had tried to murder his mother. His neighbors began to look at him with contempt. His friends began to distance themselves from him. The scandal followed him everywhere. When he went to the supermarket, people pointed at him and murmured. When he came to work, his colleagues avoided him. When he left his house, he felt the condemning looks of the entire neighborhood. But I knew this was just the beginning. The public humiliation was satisfying, but true justice was still to come. The court proceedings, the loss of his assets, the complete destruction of the life he had built on lies and betrayal. Thomas had underestimated the woman who had raised him for 40 years. He thought he could get rid of me like throwing a piece of paper in the trash. Now he was discovering he had awakened a much more powerful and ruthless monster than himself. The hunt had officially begun, and I was a hunter who had waited 40 years to show her claws. The legal process advanced like an unstoppable avalanche. Stephen had filed all the lawsuits simultaneously. Attempted murder, family fraud, aggravated fraud, and a civil lawsuit for emotional damages in the amount of $5 million. Thomas woke up on an ordinary Monday and discovered his life had shattered into 1,000 pieces. His bank account was immediately frozen. The few savings he had left after his gambling addiction were blocked while the origin of the funds was investigated. His salary was garnished to guarantee payment of the civil lawsuits. From one day to the next, he was penniless. "Dorothy," Stephen reported to me with satisfaction, "your son is broke. He can't afford a decent lawyer. He'll have to settle for a public defender against the best law firm in the city." The fight was unequal from the start. But the most delicious thing was seeing how his social world collapsed. The video of my television interview had caused such a scandal that the media began to investigate Thomas's life more deeply. Soon his gambling debts, his frauds against co-workers, his systematic lies came to light. His boss called him to an urgent meeting. "Thomas," he said, "the company cannot afford to have its name associated with this scandal. You are fired effective immediately. 20 years working at the same company, erased by a scandal he himself had created. The loan sharks who had been pressuring him for his gambling debts saw the news and decided to accelerate their collection. They knew that if they didn't act quickly, they wouldn't get back a single dollar. They began showing up at his house, calling him at all hours of the day and night, openly threatening him. One evening, while I was enjoying a glass of wine in my luxury apartment, I received a call from Leticia. She was crying. "Dorothy," she told me, sobbing. "Men came to the house, armed men. They said if Thomas doesn't pay them tomorrow, they're going to take the house and everything in it." "Where is Thomas?" I asked. "He disappeared," she replied. "When he saw those men, he fled through the back door. He left me alone with the children facing these criminals, cowardly to the end. When things got difficult, he abandoned his family to save his own skin." "Leticia," I said firmly, "take the children and go to your mother's tonight. Tomorrow morning we'll sort this out." It was time to play my next card. The next morning I went to Thomas's house, accompanied by Stephen and 2 bodyguards I had hired. The loan sharks were there, inspecting the property, calculating what they could take to cover the debts. When they saw me coming, they approached with curiosity. "Ma'am," said the leader of the group, a burly man with scars on his hands, "are you related to Thomas?" "I'm his mother," I replied with the same calm I would use to talk about the weather, "and I've come to make a proposal." I took an already signed check from my purse. "This is the exact amount my son owes you," I said. $530,000. Take it and forget about him forever." The men looked at the check in surprise. They hadn't expected an elegant woman to show up with $500,000 in cash. "Why would you do this for him?" the leader asked. "I'm not doing it for him," I replied. "I'm doing it for my daughter-in-law and my grandchildren. They're not to blame for living with a gambling addict." The man took the check, examined it carefully, and finally nodded. "Deal. Your son is debt-free with us." When they left, Leticia came out of the house with tears in her eyes. "Dorothy," she told me, "I can't accept you paying Thomas's debts." "I'm not paying them for him," I explained. "I'm paying them for you, and it's not free." I handed her a document Stephen had prepared. "It's a property transfer," I explained. "The house is now in your name. Thomas has no legal right to it anymore. And this?" I gave her another paper. "It's a loan contract. You owe me $530,000, but you can pay it back in small installments over the next 20 years. It was a perfect arrangement. Leticia was protected, the children had a safe home, and Thomas lost his last economic resource. When he finally showed up, he would discover he owned nothing anymore. That afternoon, Thomas finally called me. His voice sounded desperate, broken. "Mom," he begged, "I need your help. The loan sharks are going to kill me if I don't pay them. I need money. I need you to forgive me. I need—" "Thomas," I interrupted him coldly, "I already paid your debts." I could hear his sigh of relief on the other end of the line. "Thank you, Mom. I knew you wouldn't abandon me. I knew." "But I didn't do it for you," I continued. "I did it for Leticia and the children. And you don't have a home anymore. I transferred it to your wife's name. The house doesn't belong to you anymore. Your wife owes me the money, not you. You have nothing to do with this property anymore." His breathing became frantic. "What?" he murmured finally. "You can't do that." "The house doesn't belong to you anymore," I replied. "Dina wife owes me the money, not you. You have nothing more to do with this property." "You can't do that," he screamed. "That's my house. I bought it. You bought it with stolen money," I replied. "And now it's returned to rightful hands. Leticia and the children are protected. You're on your own." I hung up without waiting for his response. The next few days were marked by delicious tension. Thomas showed up at the house, but Leticia had already changed the locks. When he tried to break in, she called the police. The officers came and explained to him that he no longer had any legal right to the property. "But she's my wife," he screamed as they dragged him out of his own house. "You have no right to be here." "Sir," the police officer said, "your wife has requested a restraining order. You cannot come within 200 meters of this property." Restraining order. Leticia had followed my advice exactly. Now Thomas had not only lost his house, but also couldn't legally approach his family. He was a complete outcast, rejected by society and abandoned by his own people. Without a house, without work, without money, Thomas was forced to seek shelter in cheap, run-down hotels. But even that became unsustainable when the media started following him. Reporters constantly harassed him, asking him about the attempted murder, about his debts, about his gambling addiction. One evening, desperate and humiliated, he decided to do something he thought was clever, but which turned out to be the final nail in his destruction. He created a social media profile and began live streaming to tell his version of the story. "My mother is crazy," he said in front of his phone's camera from a dirty hotel room. "She's making all this up because she wants attention. I never tried to poison anyone. The chocolates were normal. She's manipulating my entire family against me. But the internet doesn't forgive." Users began bombarding him with specific questions he couldn't answer. "Why was arsenic in the chocolates?" they asked. "Why were your children poisoned?" They insisted. "Where's the evidence that your mother is lying?" His broadcast went viral, but not in the way he had expected. It went viral as an example of pathological narcissism, as a live confession of a man who couldn't take responsibility for his actions. The comments were brutal, ruthless, merciless. "This guy really thinks we're stupid," someone wrote. "His own wife is pressing charges and he says it's all a lie," another added. "Typical psychopath, always blaming others," commented a third. But what really sealed his fate was when someone asked him directly, "If you're innocent, why don't you sue your mother for defamation?" Thomas was left speechless. He couldn't sue me because he knew I had all the evidence. He couldn't deny the attempted poisoning because the evidence was irrefutable. His silence on this question was interpreted by everyone as an admission of guilt. The broadcast ended abruptly when he began receiving death threats live. He had tried to manipulate public opinion and had achieved exactly the opposite. The next day, clips from his broadcast were on all the news. Behavioral analysts dissected him as a case study in malignant narcissism. Psychologists explained on television how his inability to take responsibility was typical of antisocial personalities. Thomas had achieved something I couldn't have achieved even with the best PR team. He had destroyed his own reputation so completely and publicly that there was no going back. He had become the national villain, the symbol of a son's extreme ingratitude. But for me, the most satisfying thing wasn't his public humiliation, but the peace I saw in Leticia's eyes when I visited her, the security my grandchildren felt in their own home, the peace I had found by distancing myself from the toxicity that had dominated my life for decades. Formal justice was still in progress. But poetic justice had already been fulfilled. The son who had tried to kill me for money now didn't have a single dollar. The man who had despised my love now begged for my forgiveness. The manipulator had been exposed and rejected by everyone. I, the victim who had been silent for 40 years, had finally found my voice. The following months were a total transformation. While Thomas sank deeper and deeper into his own misery, I bloomed like never before in my life. The luxury apartment had become my sanctuary, a place where, for the first time in decades, I could breathe without the weight of constant manipulation. Stephen kept me updated on the progress of the court proceedings. "Dorothy," he told me at one of our weekly meetings, "the prosecutor is very interested in prosecuting Thomas for attempted murder. The evidence is overwhelming. The audio recordings, the medical testimonies, the confessions he himself had made. Everything formed a solid and irrefutable case. Besides," Stephen continued with a smile, "his public defender is trying to negotiate a guilty plea. He knows he can't win this case. A guilty plea would mean Thomas would have to publicly admit before a judge that he had tried to murder his own mother. But what really filled me with satisfaction was seeing how Leticia bloomed after freeing herself from the toxicity of her marriage, without the constant lies, without the financial stress, without the emotional manipulation. She had become again the strong woman I had glimpsed years before. "Dorothy," she told me at one of our weekly lunches, "for the first time in years I feel free. The children are happy, secure, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months." Seeing my grandchildren regain their innocence, seeing their genuine smiles, was worth more than any revenge I could plan. One afternoon, while I was drinking coffee on the terrace of my apartment, I received an unexpected call. It was Nora, my sister. Her voice sounded ashamed, guilty. "Dorothy," she told me, "I need to talk to you. I need to ask for your forgiveness." I decided to receive her in my house. When she arrived, the difference between us was abysmal. I looked elegant, serene, empowered. She looked consumed by guilt and shame. "Dorothy," she began with tears in her eyes, "I knew Thomas had problems, but I never thought he would be capable of killing you." "Nora," I replied with a calm that surprised me, "you always knew something was wrong with him. You always justified him, always protected him from the consequences of his actions." She nodded, unable to deny the truth. "I know I was complicit in his behavior. I know I failed you as a sister. What hurts me most," she continued, "is that I took him into my house when he came seeking shelter after the poisoning attempt. I protected him even though I knew what he had done." Her tears were real. Her remorse seemed genuine. But the damage was already done. "Nora," I said without cruelty but with firmness, "for years you chose to protect a monster instead of protecting your sister. I can't just forget that because you feel guilty now." She left my house crying, but I felt at peace. I had set clear boundaries. I had expressed my truth without concessions. The criminal trial began 6 months after the poisoning attempt. The media covered every detail, every testimony, every piece of evidence presented. I testified with a serenity that impressed even the most experienced reporters. "Mrs. Dorothy," the prosecutor asked me, "how did you feel when you discovered your son had planned your death?" "I felt liberated," I replied, looking directly at Thomas on the defendant's bench. "Liberated from 40 years of manipulation, from 40 years of unconditional love for someone who was incapable of reciprocating it." Thomas looked gaunt, aged, destroyed. His public defender had done what he could, but the evidence was irrefutable. The testimonies from Leticia, the doctors who had treated the children, the specialists who had analyzed the chocolates, all formed a perfect case. When it was time for his testimony, Thomas tried one last manipulation. "I loved my mother," he declared with false tears. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding. I never wanted to harm her." But his own recordings betrayed him. When the prosecutor played the audio recording where he confessed his plan, his version completely collapsed. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. Guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, guilty of endangering the lives of minors, guilty of aggravated fraud. The sentence was 12 years in prison without possibility of early release before serving 8 years. When I heard the verdict, I felt no triumph, but peace, justice, the legal confirmation of what I already knew, that I had been the victim of a calculated and premeditated murder attempt by my own son. Thomas looked at me from the defendant's bench as they put handcuffs on him. His eyes no longer had the arrogance of before, only desperation and self-pity. "Mom," he screamed as they took him away, "you're still my mother. You can't leave me like this." But I remained motionless, serene, watching him go toward his inevitable fate. The civil lawsuits were quickly settled after the criminal conviction. The lawsuit for emotional damages resulted in compensation of $3 million, which Thomas obviously couldn't pay from prison. But the symbolism was important. The legal system had officially recognized the damage he had caused me. Leticia obtained the divorce and full custody of the children. Thomas lost all his parental rights after being found guilty of endangering their lives. My grandchildren were finally legally protected from their father's toxic influence. One afternoon, while I was organizing my new legal documents, I found a letter I had written years ago but never sent. It was a thank you letter to Thomas for being the best son in the world. I read it and couldn't help but laugh bitterly. How blind I had been, how naive, how completely disconnected from reality. I decided to write a new letter, but this time to myself. "Dear Dorothy," I wrote, "for 40 years you confused love with complicity, kindness with compliance. You confuse sacrifice with virtue. Today I celebrate that you finally learned the difference. On my birthday, I held a small celebration in my apartment. I invited Leticia and the kids, Stephen and his wife, Julia my stylist, Robert the investigator. People who had helped me rebuild my life, who had supported me in my transformation. When I blew out the candles on my cake, I silently wished that no woman would have to wait until age 70 to find her strength, to set boundaries, to defend herself against those who abused her love. That night, alone in my apartment, I thought about the journey I had taken, from silent victim to empowered woman, from selfless mother to person who valued herself, from the woman who gave everything without receiving anything, to the woman who had learned that self-love is not selfishness, but survival. Thomas had wanted to kill me to steal my money, but he had achieved something completely opposite. He had awakened a woman I didn't know existed within me, a strong, intelligent woman capable of fighting for what belonged to her. Formal justice had been fulfilled, but the real victory was personal. I had regained my dignity, my autonomy, my right to live without fear or manipulation. The scandal followed him everywhere. 2 years after the verdict, my life had found a balance I never thought possible. The emotional wounds had healed, not with forgetting, but with wisdom. I had learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but integrating the pain into a new, stronger version of oneself. My daily routine was a testament to my newfound freedom. I woke up without the weight of fear that I had carried for decades. I had breakfast and read the financial news, because I had decided to personally manage my investments. Stephen had introduced me to Oscar, an ethical financial advisor who taught me that money could be a tool for empowerment, not just survival. Dorothy, Oscar told me during one of our sessions, you have enough capital to live comfortably for the rest of your life and leave a considerable inheritance. The word that had motivated the murder attempt now had a completely different meaning for me. I had decided to establish a trust fund for my grandchildren, managed by Leticia until they were 25 years old. I also founded a foundation to help elderly women who had become victims of family violence. My traumatic experience had become a social purpose. The children visited my apartment every weekend. Seeing their faces light up when they arrived was the strongest medicine against any remaining sadness. Grandma Dorothy, little Anna said to me, why doesn't Dad live with us anymore? These were difficult questions that Leticia and I had learned to answer honestly, age-appropriately. Dad made choices that hurt a lot of people, Leticia explained. Sometimes when someone hurts others, they have to go to a special place to learn to behave better. The children accepted these explanations with the natural resilience of childhood, but I knew that eventually they would need more details. One afternoon, while I was playing with my grandchildren in the park near my apartment, I saw an elderly woman sitting alone on a bench. She looked sad, lost, with that expression I knew all too well. I approached and struck up a conversation. I'm Joanna, she told me, not the stylist Julia, but another woman who happened to have the same name. I live with my son and his wife, but I feel invisible. They treat me like I'm a burden. Her story touched me deeply. It was like seeing my past mirrored in another person. I told her about my experience without dramatic details, but with the honesty of someone who had walked through the same darkness. Joanna, I told her, you don't have to accept being treated like a burden. You have rights, you have value, you have options. This conversation became the seed of something bigger. I began organizing weekly meetings in my apartment for elderly women going through similar situations. We called it the Circle of Strength. Every Thursday afternoon, my living room filled with stories of survival, mutual support, women who were rediscovering themselves. Stephen helped me formalize the foundation. The Dorothy Foundation for the Dignity of Elderly Women, it was finally called. Our first project was a temporary shelter for elderly women who had become victims of family violence. The second was a free legal aid program. The media began calling me to talk about the issue of elder abuse. My story had resonated so much that without seeking it, I had become a voice for other silent victims. Family violence doesn't always leave visible bruises, I said in interviews. Sometimes the abuse is emotional, economic, psychological. One morning, exactly 3 years after the poisoning attempt, I received a letter from prison. It was from Thomas. My first impulse was to throw it away unread, but curiosity won. I opened it with trembling hands. "Dear Mom," it began. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I've been reflecting on what I did." The letter continued with seemingly sincere apologies, expressions of remorse, promises of change. But there was something in the tone that felt familiar to me. The subtle manipulation, the attempt to evoke pity. "I've been attending psychological therapy," he wrote. "The psychologist says I have deep issues stemming from my early abandonment, from the death of my biological parents. Even from prison, he was still blaming others for his choices. He was still incapable of taking full responsibility. Please, Mom," the letter ended. "Give me a chance to make amends for the damage I caused. Accept a visit from me. I need to see you. I need your forgiveness to be able to heal. I need. It was always about what he needed, never about what I needed or deserved. I showed the letter to my psychologist, the doctor who had helped me in my healing process. "Dorothy," she said after reading it, "what do you feel when you read this?" "I feel sadness," I replied, "but not for him. I feel sadness because after 3 years in prison, he still doesn't truly understand what he did." "Will you respond to him?" she asked. "Will you visit him?" I thought about that question for days. Part of me, the mother I had been for 40 years, felt obligated to respond. But the new woman who had risen from the ashes knew that my healing didn't depend on forgiving the one who had tried to kill me. Finally, I decided to write a response, but not the one he expected. "Thomas," I wrote, "I received your letter. I'm glad to hear you're reflecting on your actions. However, my healing process doesn't require seeing you or forgiving you. I've built a fulfilling life without you," my letter continued. "I've found peace, purpose, and happiness. Your absence is not a void in my life. It's a space filled with tranquility. I hope you find your own redemption," I concluded. "But my path to healing no longer involves trying to save you from the consequences of your choices." I signed the letter simply with Dorothy, not with Mom. That title had been revoked the day he decided to become my potential murderer. I sent the letter and felt a deep liberation. I had definitively closed the last chapter of this toxic relationship. Leticia had also rebuilt her life. She had begun studying psychology, inspired by our family history. I want to help other families recognize signs of manipulation before it's too late, she told me. Her transformation from silent victim to active advocate was inspiring. The children were growing up healthy and secure. Occasionally they asked about their father, but without the fear they had shown during the years of family toxicity. Emotional stability had replaced the constant chaos that had marked their early years. One afternoon, while I was reviewing the Foundation's reports, I noticed something extraordinary. In 2 years, we had helped over 200 elderly women escape abusive situations. Some had recovered property stolen by manipulative children. Others had found the courage to report mistreatment. All had rediscovered their dignity. My personal survival story had become a beacon of hope for other women. The murder attempt that was supposed to silence me forever had amplified my voice beyond what I could ever have imagined. That night, as I gazed at the city from my terrace, I thought about the perfect irony of my situation. Thomas had wanted to kill me to steal my inheritance, but he had achieved that I build a much more valuable legacy, a foundation that would endure beyond my death, helping generations of women find their strength. The woman I had been for 70 years had symbolically died on the day of the poisoned chocolates. The woman born from those ashes was stronger, wiser, more complete. I had learned that sometimes, to find the light, you have to traverse the deepest darkness. My revenge had been complete, but not through Thomas's destruction, but through my own reconstruction. The best revenge had turned out to be living a fulfilled life, without fear, without guilt, without the shadow of manipulation that had darkened my days. 5 years after the poisoning attempt, my life had reached a fullness I never thought possible. The foundation had grown exponentially, with offices in 3 cities and a team of 20 dedicated professionals. We had helped over 500 women reclaim their dignity and autonomy. One morning, Stephen called me with unexpected news. "Dorothy," he said with a serious voice, Thomas is applying for parole. He's served 5 years of his sentence, and his lawyer is arguing good behavior. My heart accelerated for a moment, but the fear lasted only seconds. I was no longer the vulnerable woman I had been. What does this mean for us? I asked calmly. It means there will be a hearing, Stephen explained. The judge will review his case. He'll hear testimonies for and against his release. You have the right to testify. I decided to face Thomas one last time, but from a position of absolute power. For 5 years, I had built a new identity, a new life, a new purpose. He had been stuck in a cell, paying for his crimes. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I arrived at the courthouse with Leticia, who was now a licensed psychologist and associate director of my foundation. We dressed professionally, projecting the image of successful women we had become. When Thomas entered the room, I was shocked by his appearance. 5 years in prison had transformed him into a prematurely aged man. His hair was completely gray, his face marked by deep wrinkles, his posture bent by defeat. There was no trace of the arrogant man who had tried to murder me. His lawyer presented the case for parole. My client has shown sincere remorse, he argued. He has participated in rehabilitation programs, behaved excellently, expressed sincere wishes to make amends for the damage caused to his family. When it was my turn to testify, I stood up with the serenity of someone who has found inner peace. Your Honor, I began, I have observed the consequences of the defendant's actions for 5 years, not only in my life, but also in the lives of his children, who have been able to thrive in an environment without his toxic influence. I looked directly at Thomas as I spoke. I founded a foundation that has helped 500 women who became victims of family violence. Each of these stories reminds me why it's important that actions have real and lasting consequences. Mr. Thomas didn't just try to murder me, I continued with a firm voice. He endangered the lives of his own children, stole from his family, lied systematically for years. His early release would send a dangerous message, that remorse after arrest can nullify the severity of attempting to murder one's own mother. The judge listened attentively, taking notes. When Thomas had the opportunity to speak, he turned directly to me. Mom, he said with a broken voice, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I've changed. I've understood the damage I caused. I've spent 5 years reflecting on my mistakes. His words sounded rehearsed, calculated to evoke pity, but they no longer had power over me. Thomas, I replied calmly, you lost the right to call me mother on the day you decided to become my potential murderer. 5 years in prison don't erase 40 years of manipulation, or the trauma of discovering your own son wanted to see you dead. Leticia's testimony was devastating for his chances. As a professional psychologist, she explained to the judge the patterns of narcissistic and manipulative behavior she had observed for years. The children have been able to thrive without their father's presence, she explained. They've developed emotional stability, security, confidence. His release would represent a setback in their psychological development. The prosecutor presented evidence that Thomas had tried to contact loan sharks from prison, suggesting his gambling addiction problems persisted. He had also received money on his prison account from unknown sources, indicating continued connections to questionable activities. After 2 hours of deliberation, the judge announced his decision. Parole application denied, he declared. The defendant will serve his full sentence. The premeditated nature of his crimes, combined with the pattern of manipulative behavior and the lack of sincere remorse, make his early release inappropriate. Thomas sank into his chair. His 5 years of good behavior and mandatory therapy hadn't been enough to convince the legal system he had truly changed. He would have to serve another 7 years before being eligible for parole again. As we left the courthouse, I felt a deep but calm satisfaction. It wasn't vindictive triumph, but confirmation that justice had prevailed. Thomas would pay fully for his crimes while I continued building a legacy of hope and empowerment. That afternoon, during the weekly meeting of our Circle of Strength, I shared the experience with the women in the group. Today I faced my attacker once again, I told them, but no longer from fear or vulnerability. I faced him from the power I've built in these years, Joanna. The woman I had met years ago in the park and who now coordinated one of our programs raised her hand. Dorothy, she told me, Your story has taught us that it's never too late to reclaim our dignity. At 70, you found your strength. I found mine at 65. That night, alone in my apartment, I wrote the last entry about Thomas in my journal. Today, I buried the son I adopted 47 years ago. But the son I really loved died 10 years ago, on the day he decided to become my murderer. Today, I only buried the remains of that decision. The following months were marked by extraordinary productivity, without the looming shadow of Thomas, without the possibility of future trials or confrontations. I dedicated myself entirely to expanding the Foundation's work. We created a university scholarship program for elderly women who wanted to resume their studies after escaping abusive situations. We also founded a research center on elder abuse, directed by Leticia. Our studies began to influence national public policies for the protection of the elderly. My personal experience had become a catalyst for far-reaching social change. On my 80th birthday, we organized a charity gala for the Foundation. The event brought together politicians, business people, academics, and most importantly, hundreds of women whose lives had been transformed by our programs. During my speech that evening, I reflected on the central lesson of my experience. I learned that boundless kindness is not a virtue, but self-neglect. I learned that unconditional love must include self-love. I learned that sometimes, to save yourself, you have to be willing to disappoint those who expect you to sacrifice yourself endlessly. My story began as a tragedy, I continued. My own son's murder attempt. But it became a story of rebirth, of discovering purpose, because I chose not to remain in the role of victim, but to transform my pain into strength to help others. When I finished my speech, the 2,000 attendees rose to a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. But what moved me most were the tears in the eyes of Anna and Carl, my grandchildren, who looked at me with an admiration I had earned through example and resilience. That night, back home, I sat on my terrace and contemplated the city. 10 years earlier, I had been a 70-year-old woman, vulnerable, manipulated, nearly murdered. Now I was an 80-year-old woman, powerful, respected, with a legacy that would endure for generations. The most perfect revenge had turned out to be building an extraordinary life. Thomas had wanted to eliminate me to steal my money, but he had managed to awaken my true potential. He had wanted to silence me forever, but he had amplified my voice, turning it into a chorus of empowered women. I wrote in my journal that night, I don't regret adopting him. I only regret not understanding sooner that kindness should never be practiced at the cost of self-destruction. My son wanted to kill me, but instead of destroying me, he freed me to become who I was always meant to be. The story was over, but the legacy was just beginning. Every woman who found her strength through our programs was a victory over the mentality that had created Thomas. Every boundary set, every no spoken firmly, every act of self-love was a silent revolution against the culture that teaches women to give everything without receiving anything. It had taken me 70 years to find my power, but I had used every day of the last 10 years to ensure other women didn't have to wait that long. That was my true legacy. Not money, but wisdom. Not possessions, but purpose. Not revenge, but victory through transformation.